What is up, everyone? My name is Michael Pohl with Bay Area Aquatics, and today we're going to be talking about setting up a quarantine tank and the process you should do before introducing fish to your main aquarium. So I've done a video on this in the past, but I've changed my process up a little bit, changed the tank that I do it in, and changed kind of just a couple little things about it, and I'm getting a lot of questions on it recently, and so I figured I'd just go ahead and put out a new video explaining what I do now and why I do it. Another thing I want to point out is there are a lot of ways to quarantine fish. There's a lot of ways to medicate fish, and this is just the way that I do it. There's not necessarily a wrong way. The equipment I use is not, make or break equipment. There's not necessarily a right way to do it. There can be a couple of wrong ways, but as long as it works for you, it works, and this has worked for me and kept my aquariums pretty disease-free. I haven't had anything crazy outbreak unless I don't quarantine, which I've done once or twice, and every single time I've done it, I've had issues, and I end up having to medicate tanks and lost fish, and so quarantining is a big, important step that I don't think enough people do, but it is something I definitely do. So one of the things that's different this time, or now, versus when I first made that video, is I don't use a 5.5 gallon tank anymore. I use a 10-gallon tank, and I wanted to use a 10-gallon tank the first time. I just didn't have the space for it, and the 5.5 gallon fit where I had space for it. So that was the tank I could fit. I know people who quarantine in a 5-gallon bucket. I've seen people quarantine in the HGX storage totes from Home Depot. That's what I actually use for ponds outside. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a glass aquarium, but something that can hold water. I saw someone on Facebook that did one of the totes, and they kept all their quarantine supplies in the storage tote and dry and up in the garage when they weren't using it. And then when they needed it, they pulled it down and everything was just set there ready to go. So that's a really good way to do it if you don't have space for another tank, but you could set a tub on the floor or something like that. One of the pros to a glass 10-gallon aquarium is most medications are giving dosing instructions per 10 gallons. So a lot of general cure, erythromycin, a lot of the pre-done stuff is done in 10-gallon increments or in 10-gallon doses. And so it makes it very easy to dose medicines. It's just one packet, one XYZ dose of this or that or whatever medicine you're actually doing. Another advantage of having a glass aquarium versus like a bucket or a tub or something like that is you're able to see the fish from the side. You're able to see the fish a lot better. You're able to watch and examine the fish a lot better, which is important in a quarantine stage because not everything is super visible, and you're not always going to be able to watch the habits of them from above. Or ick might be on their underside, and or calamaris worms, right? You're not necessarily going to see that from above, but looking at it from the side, you'll notice the calamaris worms. So there's pros and cons to it, and if you're going to use something that's not a glass aquarium that you can't see in from the side, just make sure that you're watching the fish every now and then, maybe pulling them out in a specimen container or something, and double checking them just before you go through quarantine. It's going to stress them out a lot more, which is a big con to that, but I think it's an important step and something that needed to be pointed out. As far as other equipment, I use a 50-watt heater in mine. I would recommend a heater because a lot of things things like ick, you can raise the temperature and treat it, versus even if you're in like a fish room or something where it's temperature controlled and you don't necessarily need a heater, or you're getting fish that you don't think need a heater. You don't have to have the heater plugged in, but having a heater handy just in case you need to crank the temperature up can be very, very helpful. I have the best success treating ick at 86 degrees. Not all fish can handle that, but fish that can, that's my first go-to, is to crank the temperature up to 86 and then dose it with salt. Another piece of equipment that I use in my quarantine tank is a box filter. Now, I like my box filters because I use hang-on back filters, so I have ceramic media to be able to instantly cycle a tank. That being said, you don't need a box filter. You can use a hang on the back, you can use a sponge filter, you can use whatever type of filter you like. The pros of having the box filter is I can pull media from my hang on the back and have it instantly cycled. Some people do not worry about cycling the tank, and it kind of depends on your flow. So I know some people that do water changes every single day in their quarantine tank, and they only keep an air stone in the tank. Just to keep the oxygen in the water, but they're doing enough water changes that they don't necessarily need a filter since it's not going to be a long-term tank. in my opinion, it never hurts to have a filter that's cycled. As far as a sponge filter, you can keep an extra one in, one of the side tanks. My biggest thing with sponge filters is they're hard to kind of disinfect and dry out and clean. And box filters are a lot easier, and I can just toss the ceramic media away or let it sit out in the sun, and then put it back in the filter later. I don't have to worry about, making sure that specific sponge filter is clean and sanitized and ready to go. Another thing I like to have on my quarantine tanks that aren't necessarily necessary, but are very good ideas, is I like to have a lid on the tank, especially if you have the temperature up. It helps keep the humidity in, keeps the water level up, and it just prevents things from going in. It's always a good practice to have a lid on a tank, in my opinion. I also like to have a light on the tank just so you can see the fish better. Not everyone does. Some people will do a flashlight, or however you want to do it, that's fine. I just find having a dedicated light makes it easier to see. Doesn't have to be a nice light. It can just be a cheap light. Doesn't have to be anything crazy. But it's a lot easier to see things with your fish when you can actually see them versus when you can kind of see them in the dark and you can't really see everything on them. The other thing I like to have is an air stone with an air pump. And even if I'm running a box filter, I like to have an air stone and an extra air pump or an extra air outlet ready just in case. I'm not necessarily running it, but if I ever crank the heat up in the aquarium, that lowers the oxygen level, and I will always throw an air stone in. I've had it in the past where I've had a sponge filter, had the heat cranked way up, and I was having oxygen problems, and when I put the second air stone in, the problems went away. I don't think that's the case all the time, but in my opinion, better to be safe than sorry. It's good practice, and you can never have too oxygenated water. Well, you can, but you're probably not going to get there as an aquarist. Lastly, I like to keep my quarantine tanks bare bottom, and for hides, if I put hides in a tank, I will use PVC. Some people like to do the gravel in that, and I tried it, but I just was not a fan of it. It was hard to clean, it was hard to kind of sanitize afterwards, and I ended up throwing the gravel away. And so I just go bare bottom. It's easier to keep clean, it's easier to keep track of the fish poops and things like that. How much food they're eating, how much food they're not eating. It's just a lot easier to see things when there's not a lot of stuff in the tank. If you have fish that need hides or are more comfortable with hides, you can pick up some like PVC 90-degree elbows or end caps and make little PVC caves. I don't do that normally unless I have only a handful of fish or they're kind of aggressive or something like that. So for example, for this video, the B-roll is a shipment of platies that I had coming in, and they're not a super aggressive fish, and there's a lot of them, so they're just going to go in the tank and not going to have any protection because it'll be kind of spread out. As far as what I do once they are in the tank, I keep them in the quarantine tank for 2 weeks from when I saw disease last. So if they come in and they look fine, they'll spend 2 weeks in the quarantine tank, nothing comes out, everything's all good, they'll go right into my tanks. If they come in and they have ick on them, or velvet or whatever else, I will treat them, and once I do not see that disease anymore, that's when the 2 weeks starts for me. That's worked best for me personally, and I know a lot of other people that have that same time frame. Usually when I have fish in a quarantine tank, the tank tends to be a little on the overstocked side. I do that on purpose just because I want the 10-gallon tank. That being said, sometimes I'm only buying 6 fish, 4 fish, 5 fish, and it's not overstocked. But either way, I tend to do a lot of water changes on my quarantine tank just to make sure the water's good and clear and I don't have an issue with the overstocking, which is why some people don't use a filter, is they're doing so many water changes, it's not a problem. But I try to limit water changes when I can, because one of the problems with water changes is you then have to redose medication. And some of the medication prefers to just sit in the water and not have a water change done to it. So that's something you do need to watch. And I pre-medicate everything that comes into the fish room. They get a hit of General Cure, a hit of erythromycin, and then a hit of ICX, which is the classic aquarium co-op trio before they switch to the Fritz medication. And the Fritz medication is still the same stuff, it's just a different company. But that's the brand I like to use, is because it's available locally to me, is the API General Cure, API erythromycin, and then ICX I have to buy on Amazon, but it's on Amazon, so it gets here pretty quick. last but not least, when I'm done quarantining fish, I disinfect the tank and the heater and the filter and everything else with diluted vinegar. So I get a cup of vinegar and I forget how much water. I think it's like a gallon of water. You can find cleaning solution vinegar ratios online. Sometimes I just pour some water in the tank and throw a splash of vinegar in there and rub it out and clean it out and let everything kind of disinfect and sanitize. But that's how I clean it. It's cheap, it's easy, it doesn't hurt the fish, and I don't have to worry about it. I just realized after I said that, you don't want to put vinegar in the tank when there's fish in the tank, but when you put vinegar in the tank, then you rinse it out once or twice, it's a lot less harmful and won't harm the fish versus like if you have leftover bleach in the tank. So I just wanted to clarify that. Don't put vinegar in the tank with fish, but it's good to use while you're cleaning. So yeah, that's how I quarantine my fish now, and let me know in the comments down below how you quarantine your fish. What practices do you do? What things do you find are necessary or unnecessary? I'm always curious how everyone else does it. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, you know what to do. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification so you get notified every time I upload a video. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.